Well, hello everybody. We're on top of the hour, and I would suggest that we start without further ado. We have a rich menu, and I'm sure there'll be more people joining later. I'm Marcus Kummer. I'm the co-facilitator of the Dynamic Coalition Coordination Group. And today we have a webinar. It's the third in a series devoted to the theme capacity building in the digital age. The session description puts it quite succinctly and explains that digital technologies are transforming every aspect of our lives. There are tremendous opportunities, but there is also the danger that it will actually widen the digital divide, and hence the need for capacity building. Now, this webinar has a stellar panel of experts and aims to provide answers on how to bridge the digital divide, on how to create a digital ecosystem that upholds the WSIS principles of a people-centered information society, which is built on the respect of human rights. This is the main objective of this webinar. We have some secondary objectives, and I would say there are three separate objectives. One is to prepare the DC sessions at the IGF 2025 in Oslo next month. So this is a very practical input into these sessions. And then the second of these objectives is also to put the DCs on the broader map of the IGF stakeholders. And lastly, explain what the DCs are and how they function. Now, this is not a secret to the panelists and to people who are familiar with the DCs, but I think it deserves explanation to people who may be less familiar with the DCs. Now, the first of these secondary objectives is the DC sessions in Oslo. The DCs have 4 workshops and the main session, and this webinar will feed into these sessions. The second of these secondary objectives is explain what the DCs are, and I take that from the blur we have prepared for the DC main sessions. The DCs can be considered engines of innovation, dialogue, and community-driven research on some of the most pressing issues of internet governance. And that brings me to the third objective: explain how they work and how they function. And what are the DCs? They are a constituent part of the IGF ecosystem. They are bottom-up, self-organized, with a minimal set of common rules. And what makes them so different from other, shall we say, working groups in international organizations is they are not mandated from above, from a top authority. Like, for instance, the ITU has study groups, but they are authorized by the ITU Council, so they are mandated from above. The DCs are self-constituent from the bottom. They are bottom-up. The common rules are very minimal. So far, we have the so-called 4 O's, the 4 openness, open membership. Anyone who wants to be a member can be a member. We have open mailing lists, so they can be checked by anyone who wants to know what's happening. And we have open archives. And there is one obligation that all DCs have to provide an annual report. We're currently in the process of looking on how to enhance the accountability, and we are exploring whether to endorse or implement the Sao Paulo multi-stakeholder guidelines and take elements of these guidelines and make them also mandatory. But again, this is a bottom-up collective process. And we are in the process of looking into this. And I think I would like to ask you, Rajendra, before asking you to take it away, I would be amiss not commending you for putting this all together. And with the help of Roman sitting next to you, I take it you're in the IGF Secretariat today. And thank you to you both for putting this together and also then giving us maybe an outlook on the last webinar of the series. Over to you, Rajendra. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Marcus, so much for the introduction and setting out the context of the webinars and the DCs. I think to all those joining, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from whichever part of the world you're joining. If you really look back at this third webinar, the first one was AI governance for humanity's benefit. Second was security in digital age. And third is obviously logically capacity building in digital age, because you cannot meet objective of either of them without capacity building. So it is crucial. And there are two kind of capabilities I want to talk here to set the context. There is a organizational maturity, there is a technical maturity. So when you look at technology in terms of what it has achieved, we probably have reached a high level of technical maturity. But the organizational maturity, if it is not there, you cannot leverage technical maturity. That means that people will need to be having that capacity to absorb what technology can deliver. Having said that, building capacity is like building collective intelligence. And over time, we have understood that capacity building is not just about human capacity. It is multidimensional. It is dynamic. It is multidimensional. It's an ongoing process. And I would say it starts with human capacity as first. There is a institutional capacity where we talk about governance, leadership development. There is infrastructural capacity where we talk about digital infrastructure, cloud security, interoperable systems. Then a very important part is the policy and regulatory capacity, because we got to also align to that. And then there is collaborative capacity. I think I would allude this to Andrea in one of our similar webinars. She made a very interesting point on collaboration, that collaboration is more important than money. And it is very right. And then last one, and most important, is innovation capacity. So just imagine, the kind of things we are going to discuss today in this webinar on capacity building and the kind of dimensions capacity brings to the table for all of us to understand. And as IGF, that is why I call it like the platform to discuss things comprehensively, holistically, and deep dive. We have an excellent panel today of global leaders, Avri Doria from SIG faculty and DC on Schools of Internet Governance, about the Natris, coordinator of Internet Standards, Security and Safety Coalition IS3C, Stefani Perrin, President Digital Discretion, DC on Digital Financial Inclusion, Martin Waterman, DC IoT and board member of ICANN, Utah Kroll, DC on Child Rights and Digital Ecosystem, Mohammed Shabir, IGF Dynamic Coalition Accessibility and Disability, and of course my colleague Roman from the IGF Secretariat, who is the main connector for making all these things possible. So I would start with Avri, with you, to ask your views on this topic and what do you want to share to start with. And then eventually we'll go, when we complete the first panel, is to go back to the questions based on the discussions. Over to you, Avri.
Thank you. Took me a second to find my unmute button. Thank you very much for that introduction, for introducing me. And I do want to step back and look first at, given what was said about capacity building, given that every document, the GDC, that we have, speaks about the importance of capacity building, to look at what do the dynamic coalitions have to do with capacity building. And I mean, going beyond, I coordinate the Dynamic Coalition on Schools and Internet Governance. It's easy to say, yes, we do schools. We go out and educate people. We look at how to form schools around the world, and therefore, of course, we're working on capacity building, whether it's in governance or the specific issues, human rights, or how to do policy for blockchain. The schools look at those things. That is one important element of capacity building. But it goes much beyond that. When you look at what the DCs are doing, the dynamic coalitions are doing, they are first, they're taking these subjects that are impeding upon the world, impeding upon the United Nations, whether it's child protection, whether it's blockchain, whether it's, how to work with financial markets, how to interact with gaming. That basically it's looking at all these things and trying to understand, similar to what was being said, there is the technology is moving along, it's real, it's out in the world, but what about the policy component of it, and how do we figure out? So the dynamic coalitions are very much involved in that. Look at the technology, figure out, given the guidance, the governance frameworks that we live in the IGF and elsewhere, and also the Sao Paulo guidelines that we're looking at now, how do you find policy that fits with that particular technology bailiwick? So that is an element. Each of the TCs, the DCs going down its particular route and understanding that. Then there's the next part of what the dynamic coalitions do, and you can look back on a long history of documents that they put out, on papers, on white papers, on webinars to talk about these things. So basically, each of those DCs, once they've gone through their process of figuring out how do we map, which is a big part of our capacity. Our capacity is, how do we build policy for all these things? How are we ready with policy for the next set of emergent technology? And then basically, how do we convey that to the rest of the community? How do we create output that can then be useful to others in terms of their capacity to build policies for things? The place where we're still growing and we still need to sort of do a lot is how to then take those last steps and turn that work into outcomes that the IGF can use, or that the GDC can use, or in whichever set of initials come next can use, to basically raise the capacity of the general public, of the general governance framework, to actually, raise capacity and do something useful. I'll stop there. But that's basically the view that I take in terms of looking at this from the point of view of someone that spends a lot of their time trying to do capacity building. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Sorry. So Avi, you have a wonderful capacity to, get the right words at the right time. And what you said is interesting, is that we are contributing to the intellectual capacity of the entire ecosystem and not just one silo of it. Wonderful. And this brings me to you out, given your important work on the internet standard, security, and safety. How are we building capacity on that? And I know you have been doing work globally on this. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Regenda, and also Roman, of course, and Marcus for the introduction. My name is Wouter Natus van der Borgt, and I'm the coordinator of IS3T, as mentioned. And IS3T's shared goal is making online activity and interaction more secure and safer by achieving more widespread and rapid deployment of existing security-related Internet standards and ICT best practices. Internet standards and ICT best practices are what makes the modern world tick. They make it possible for us to communicate and interact via the internet, to access or build websites, to buy online, to use apps, to share and find information, etc. But all these standards have one thing in common. They were developed without security in mind. Over time, the technical community has provided updates or patches to make the internet more secure and safer to use. But the voluntary nature of deploying these new standards, called DNSSEC or RPKI or the OWASP Top 10, etc., has led to a very slow uptake, leaving us all needlessly exposed to threats and crimes. There are many, many reasons for this, as described in my report setting the standard for the IGF in 2020, and I'll put the link in the chat in a moment. But one of them is that it's too technical a topic, and I've got a secret here to tell. It is not. And we need capacity building to bring that message across to policymakers, to politicians, etc., etc. In the past, I3C has produced 3 reports and 2 toolkits providing recommendations and actions that bring online security and safety much closer. For example, an updated tertiary education cybersecurity curriculum. In current policy in IoT security, there are 442 different recommendations for industry from just 21 jurisdictions, and some are totally contradictory. But foremost, we found that governments hardly procure ICTs with cybersecurity in mind. So there's a whole world to win out there. And here is where capacity building kicks in. In 2010, when providing a training in South Africa for Afrinic, government representatives told me that where ICT services were concerned, it was sign here or you don't receive anything. And today they say the same to me. So nothing has changed. I also heard a government official very recently said we cannot procure internet standards as they are not written in governmental language. But the language is irrelevant. The standards are there. So what are we talking about? The Dutch government proves every day that you can procure secure by design, and yet it took 3 years of negotiations with one big tech company to deploy one standard. It teaches me that on the one hand, there's power play at stake, but on the other hand, there's still a level of ignorance concerning internet security. And this has to change, and this can only happen by delivering the same message time and again to the most influential people responsible for policies and decision making. And this is what the IGF is uniquely built for, because of its multi-stakeholder and more informal nature. But it is a challenge that it has to take up. IS3C's tool on arguments, using for technical people to convince their bosses to deploy internet standards is our most popular. Blog posts are written about it, invitations to presentations are provided, and this is exactly what IS3C tries to do, advocate its work in different ways. Our new report, to be published in Lillestrøm, is on post-quantum encryption. It is not about the day that quantum is upon us, it's about the years before the so-called Q-Day. It asks and shows how the world can protect itself, our digital lives, our policies, our identities, our trade secrets, our passwords to private information and vital infrastructure alike, before Q-Day. So that once it's there, we are prepared for a new digital invention. But history shows that we are extremely bad at this, as the advent of the internet, social media, AI, etc. has taught us. It was there all of a sudden, and years to decades later, we are still grappling with negative results. With Q-Day somewhere on the horizon and hybrid forms of computing already being seriously tested, we need to ask ourselves, is this what we want again? Or do we want to prepare? Can we leave this to the market to deal with? But what has history taught us there? With AI hallucinating somewhere between 15 and 60% and algorithms behind social media a black box, how do we teach our children to recognize this and thus protect democracy for the future? If people are to use digital technology, including AI, they need to develop a broad set of competences to be capable of critical thinking, to understand the impact that digital technology has on their own life and on human rights and democracy in general. To act on all these topics, capacity building is essential. As I said, the IGF is uniquely placed to bring stakeholders together and produce policy recommendations. It also means the IGF and DCs need to organize themselves better, so that the work of DCs like IS3C lands where it has to land, to have the impact it deserves and needs. This result will most likely ensure more participation in intersectional processes and the funding to conduct first-class research in the first place. I personally set out in 2019 to show that an IGF process can deliver a serious report on a serious topic. And this was at a time that hardly anybody within the IGF ecosystem knew what DCs were. And look at where we are today. Even the Office of the Tech Envoy, it has a new name, ODET, is advocating DC outputs as important. and recognizing the future need for better recognition of our reports. But also this recognition was part of capacity building, of outreach, of presenting to the right people at the right moment. DCs matter and need to show it proactively to the world, just like we are today in this webinar. And that is capacity building for you. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to hear all the other presenters today. Thank you, Rajendra.
Thank you, Wout. And starting with Avri on the intellectual capacity, and you move to the ethical capacity and beyond. I have questions coming up once we complete all the panelists. We'll get to that. Stefani, you represent digital discretion, DC on digital financial inclusion. How do you see capacity building? This is something which is close to all of us because financial inclusion would not happen without capacity building. Want to hear your thoughts?
Thank you very much. And I'm actually stepping in for Aidan Federline, who's leading this coalition. I have been working with Interledger for the past year to come up with a best practice framework for privacy and data protection and human rights with respect to modern financial systems. So that is kind of my angle on things. But I thought I would talk about the policy blueprint that we are working on, basically a policy blueprint for interoperable payment protocols. Now, the Interledger has a foundation, was instrumental in creating an open source payments protocol that promises to make payments as easy as an email. The problem, of course, is getting that stitched into the financial systems. And just because we can make payments easier and allow the poorest to stop paying ridiculous rates for transferring money, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. So in the policy blueprint for interoperable payment protocols, we have identified 4 main pillars: open and inclusive governance, technical standardization, regulatory and design considerations, and consumer-focused ecosystem design. Now, you can tell from those 4 broad categories, there's a lot of work that basically knits into all the work that my fellow panelists are doing involved in getting this thing actually to benefit the poor and the unbanked. We talk a lot about financial inclusion. There's a lot of hand waving, but the actual amount that the poor, migrant workers, single parents, the amount that they pay as a percentage of their income is still dramatically higher than the rich. And we're not getting rid of that gap. So now in my own work, and I've been working in privacy for 40 years, I have to say financial regulation is not for the faint of heart. I have been trying to get data maps, to try to do, to model human rights impact assessments. This information is not readily available, and we need it. If we are going to solve this gap between the rich and the poor, then people need to understand what needs to be done. We cannot depend on the banks, for instance, to take on the job of looking after the poor. I'm a former federal government worker. In my view, as a policy person, I see responsibilities for government everywhere. And I think that governments do need to step up and subsidize some of these risk assessments. Why? Because cybercrime is exploding. And I'm trying to protect privacy, data protection, the risk assessments that unnecessarily close people out of better digital banking systems. They are going to be galloping in on us now that we have AI-enhanced cybersecurity issues. So this is one of the challenges that I see. We're hitting a wall in terms of capacity building. We're trying to get more transparency about the banking system. We're also trying to get better privacy about the data that is collected, but there will be a huge push to find out more about where money's going from A to B. And I'm a privacy advocate, but even my first priority when I'm banking is to make sure my money gets from A to B. On top of this, we have an absolute explosion of rival payment systems. People do not understand what a stable coin is. The President of the United States issues a crypto coin. Does anybody know what that is or how it works? We have many, many papers on digital currencies coming. Does anybody understand how a digital currency might work? And in the absence of any sort of international regulatory body that controls banking and payments, there is a growing risk, I would say, of national approaches to these things that might not interoperate. And I get back to the 4 key pillars of this paper. So capacity building in terms of getting people to understand banking, and it's taken me a year of work at Interledger talking with a bunch of payment experts with great technical capacity to try to understand this. There is a lack of transparency. I don't actually know who can take on the education role. We cannot foist that onto our payment systems at the same time as they face unprecedented cybersecurity threats from AI and impersonation. As a privacy person, we warned for years, don't put your face out on the internet. Somebody else will get the facial recognition capacity. Don't put your voice out on the internet. But of course, everybody's voice is out there. Ours is probably out there right now. We now have bots that will do the work for the criminals. So as I say, there's a real challenge here. How much can a poor person who's working 3 jobs or a migrant worker who's, an agricultural worker in Canada, how much can they understand about the payment system that sends money back home in order to make good choices in the absence of regulation? So these are the challenges. I think our goals is with this coalition is to get more people engaged. We can't talk about financial inclusion if we don't talk about the necessary mechanisms to make it real.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I think you made this very important point of the knowledge capital here. First we need to bridge that. So starting from the intellectual, ethical, and the knowledge. Now we have Mr. Martin, who is with DC IoT and also on the board of ICANN. Martin, how do you see this issue of capacity building crucial when we are talking of Internet of Things?
Yes, thank you for this and the previous speakers also for highlighting a lot of important issues. I mean, if we want this one internet to serve all stakeholders, you need to be aware, able to act and act it. And the awareness is somewhere capacity building comes in, but also to make able is necessary, because all the things we know and all the things we do somewhere in the world may be needed somewhere else. I think the clear indication that the earlier speakers also gave, you've got something like a digital divide. How do we ensure that technologies needed can be deployed where they are needed? And trust. How can we ensure that this beautiful thing we call the internet that has so much opportunities doesn't become something to stay away from because you're afraid to be hurt, to lose your privacy, to lose your money, your assets. So there's a real task. Now, of course, there's not only criminals to work on new methods to get to us. It's of course, it's not only governments that should do the work. I think it's important that all stakeholders take their role. What we do see is that the internet ecosystem partners understand also the need for people to be aware. They're part of the chain. It's not just, I can take care of the addresses in principle together with its ecosystem partners, but to use it safe, people, even users in the end, need to know that if somebody asks you to send the money, that think twice before you do. So it's a whole chain of things. How to know whether the email you receive is actually email from the people you expect to get them from. There's all kinds of standards that help distinguish this. So there's a lot of global knowledge. A lot of that is on offer via also online learning systems from trusted parties like Internet Society, ICANN, and others. There is the local also teachings in the schools for internet governance around the world. I dare say also in the regional IGF sessions, which are part of capacity building as I see it, because they also raise awareness in the region. And this is all because it's so important that this global understanding of what needs to be done, global understanding of how good looks like, is confronted with local needs, ensures that locally the knowledge is there to do something with it appropriate, to ensure it's implemented in the right way. The Dynamic Coalition for IoT has been working on a global understanding of global good practice. Now, this is not very detailed. It's about meaningful transparency, that not just a lot of information, but also information you can do something with, whether you're a user, whether you're a supplier, whether you're a government. The second element is user agency, that users do have an appropriate control, and this relates to the transparency as well. And the third thing is, of course, security, because if things are not secure, any abuse, any confusion, anything is possible. And last but not least, privacy, also from IoT perspective. But I think there's more. The more we enter a digitized society, the more it's possible to get a movie of our lives. You just ask AI, and they can produce it if they have access to all the resources. How would it be if that would not be possible? How would it be if we can trust that some of the things we do that are not desperately illegal or be done in some private and trusted setting? So my plea is for let's make sure that this global knowledge that we do have, that is getting more clearer every time, on the risks, on how to cope with it, is confronted with the local needs and ensures that there's enough local knowledge and access to knowledge to make sure that this is applied. Because this is the only way we can keep an internet we trust and have digital services available where they need to be. Examples again are the IGF regional events, the School for Internet Governance, the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise is doing local events on capacity building as well, and other initiatives take place. So my plea is that as DCs, as IGF, we keep that view clear, local knowledge confronting with global knowledge confronted with local needs, and helping make sure that people around the world can step up and learn how to deal with that in their environment.
Thanks, Martin. I think a very important point that you talk about, it's participatory governance. As I said, that you make it bottom up and people understand it better to make sure that the internet is not abused. This brings me and logically Utah. Utah is coordinating a very important DC on child rights in digital ecosystem. Given the fact that we still call internet a future technology and the future is the children of today, Utah, so your views and voice matters a lot in terms of how you see this topic from your DC perspective.
Yes, thank you, Rajendra, for giving me the floor, and thanks also to the speakers and panelists we've heard before, which helped me to refer a bit to what you have said. Although the focus of the Dynamic Coalition on Children's Rights is on children, I would like to broaden the perspective now to all users, because we've already heard references to everybody needs to build their capacity and to be educated in that way, but with a focus on human rights, to non-discrimination, to freedom of speech and access to information, to the right to privacy and the right to peaceful assembly and association.
These rights oblige us to enable everybody to take part in the digital age, which is not the case, although more and more people now have access. But the question would be, is it really meaningful access and able to make the best out of it? My experience in this regard dates back to the turn of the millennium, when even in developed countries, less than 1/3 of the population had ever heard about the internet, let alone had access to digital services, which was when the term digital divide was coined. Nowadays, we need to face that it's a digital literacy divide, and which is even widening in the course of the time. There are many challenges that come from the fast speed of technical innovation. And I would say the lessons that we are teaching in regard of capacity building of digital skills and competencies, the lessons we are teaching today will be outdated tomorrow. So my main questions for the debate that will follow our input would be, what capacities, competencies, and skills are we talking about? We have mentioned several, but still we don't have a real framework for this. And how can we define these competencies and skills in a landscape of rapidly evolving technical developments and innovations like, for example, generative AI? How do we develop and adapt curricula that we are already using, or how do we adapt them to these new innovations? Do we have quality standards to be controlled in this regard? How do we ensure that what we deliver to those who are asking for capacity building is phrased in the right way and is correct? And how do we assess achievements, and how do we identify lacks? Last but not least, how do we counteract discrimination in this regard? And I would like to refer to what Stephanie has said before. I really appreciate that you talked about consumer-focused service design, and that is, of course, will help to counteract discrimination also in regards of capacity building. My final question would be a policy question, and that is, do we need strong international regulatory frameworks to address the aforementioned issues? And I would like to give you one example. The recently released EU Artificial Intelligence Act includes in Article 4 an obligation for companies and organizations that employ AI tools to implement capacity building measures for their staff. While it does not hold an obligation for governments to establish capacity building programs on artificial intelligence literacy for their citizens altogether. Is this just ignorance of the demands the digital age holds for all people? Or is it in the hope that people will be able to cope on their own with these challenges of capacity building? Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Jutta. And I think you have a very important point, and I totally subscribe to that, because if we see the development of technology, well, the world has talked of large language models, now we have moved to large action models. While we talked of AI became generative AI, now become multimodal AI. So how do you train the capacity for future, which is moving pretty fast? And we are talking of a generation which is still children. So I think it is something that we have to take a serious view on, and we'll come to that as we get to the next phase of questions. But also, I think as we talk of capacity, we shouldn't forget the people, with what we call as accessibility challenges, disability, or even neurodiversity. I mean, I would always bring that topic because that's a bigger problem that's coming with time. And we're lucky to have Mohammed Shabir from the IGF DC on accessibility and disability. Mohammed Shabir, will look forward to your views on this topic of capacity building.
Thank you, Dr. Rajendra, and thanks the earlier speakers who have given me a much of a lead to speak upon the topic. And I would take lead from my colleague who spoke on digital financial inclusion, while she lamented the fact that there are gaps between poor and rich, and then they don't know the choices. Uh, if you are not woken to the reality, I would give you one more thing. There are people who don't even have choices, or who don't even get choices in terms of financial inclusion. While they are whether they are earning or not, that's another question. But whether the financial system gives you the choices is the key thing. And as inclusive societies, what we all as human beings expect from the society is that humans should have choices. But in there are countries, whereas in the developed world, things including technologies, policies, and technical capacities have risen to so much level that even persons with disabilities, a person with a vision impairment, would be working in a bank. In some of the developing parts, still there are areas where a person with vision impairment would not be allowed to open an independent bank account, much less to talk about carrying a credit card, debit card, or using internet services. So this is the reality, and people with disabilities form about 1.2 or 1.2 or 3 billion of the total world's population. Some would call them the largest global minority. While the characteristics may differ, but the approaches that are there to deal with people with disabilities by different government institutions and organizations, they, by one way or the other, are similar. And the objective of the dynamic coalition on accessibility and disability is to build the capacity of not just the organizations, not just the institutions, not just the governments, but also the people with disabilities who, in some instances, may not even know what their rights are. And I understand this is a very huge task to take on to, but someone has to take that. And dynamic coalition on accessibility and disability in its limited capacity is trying to meet to this requirement and try to build this capacity. It is using two things in terms of the capacity building. One is the guidelines that the Internet Governance Forum uses to organize its meetings to make them accessible. At the second level, nothing about us without us. The dynamic coalition on accessibility and disability tries to bring people with disabilities to the IGF and participate in there. So, in that context, what we try to do is we try to bring people with disabilities through the fellowships and the general grants of the Windsurf and Google LLC to make them participate in the actual discussions. And if we talk about capacities, there are a number of organizations and institutions that are participating in building capacity of persons with disabilities and also their own capacities. In the internet governance ecosystem, there are some organizations which are doing more, some are doing less, but we are slowly trying to build awareness amongst those organizations. To name a few, there is Asia Pacific Regional Internet Governance Forum that provides fellowships, have a dedicated slot, including the persons with disabilities in making part of those discussions. Also, the Asia Pacific School on Internet Governance has carries the same provision as one fellowship slot is dedicated for people with disabilities. I have talked about the DCAD. Internet Society Board recently passed a resolution on on making the organization itself accessible for people with disabilities. They are working on that. And I hope to have this capacity built amongst other organizations as well. If you or your organization were interested in building any kind of capacity for your organization, or if you are interested in building capacity for people with disabilities to make them aware of their own rights, you can contact info at the igf-dcad.org. Myself or my co-coordinator will be in touch with you. I stop here. If there are any questions, we can address those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed Shabir. I think very important points, and all of us who have been involved with IGF know that one of the things has been connected, the unconnected. And again, there's another subset of those who are connected, but yet not capable of leveraging the opportunity internet offers. And you have very brilliantly put forth those points. And this brings me back to a very important question, being involved in drafting an education policy. And education remains a very good segue into building capacity. And I would want to throw this question to Martin, who's also on the board of ICANN. Martin, on one side, we have a challenge of almost like 2.6 billion people not yet connected to the internet. So we are losing a huge amount of economic opportunity we could offer those people. So that's one segment. But those who are already there, how do we create capacity for them through the education system?
Well, thank you for asking the question. I didn't see it coming. Otherwise, I wouldn't have just swallowed that peanut. But it's a good point. I mean, it's great that the internet serves 2/3 of the world, but it doesn't serve the last third of the world yet. And we know that they'll need it. Now, the internet isn't only communication between people anymore. It's become much more. So fortunately, also some of that vast third can benefit from services like the tsunami warning system, which is internet-based and things like that. And these kind of applications are easy to offer. The other thing you see is that in developing, in the less advanced nations in terms of internet uptake, schemes are developed to introduce it via public libraries, other points, to come with initial access points. And the awareness that people need access is very true. That is very much recognized. It's been dealt with in different ways. Next to availability is also affordability. And you see that, for instance, in India, with everything said and done, one key factor is that access via mobile to internet is affordable there. It's cheap. In some African countries, you see it's really a challenge to get connected via video, not only because bandwidth is low, but also because costs are high. Now, so together we were addressing it. We also see it on the development agenda as an important part, next to clean water, food, that also access to information, being able to tap into the information society becomes a possibility. So I think the last thing, and where we contribute from an ICANN perspective, together with organizations like UNESCO, is the recognition that not everybody talks English or understands English or uses even Latin characters. So in that way, we also think it's important to facilitate using the internet in different languages and different characters. And that will help for people to get access. The internet itself is an excellent means to help in part of the capacity development. And you really need local actors that are well informed, that may be trained by global players, by or participate in IGF, and take it to the regions to really make sure that it progresses. iControl, make sure that other languages, other scripts are also increasingly usable on the internet. My role goes well beyond that. And so is for most of you, I think.
Thank you, Martin. And Stephanie, I want to put this question to you. I mean, Martin put this very important point of affordability. So when we talk about financial inclusion, how is affordability tied to capacity building, given the fact that we are in the digital age, and what are the innovative things that you have come across that you would like to share with the audience?
Thank you. Well, many of the projects that the Interledger Foundation is funding are basically building community networks that provide low-cost banking services to people who are unbanked for various reasons, either because they lack the identity necessary. In some countries, migrant workers aren't allowed into the banking system, and then they're at the mercy of commercial financial payment services that gouge them, basically. They gouge them in many ways. They charge high fees, and they charge unrealistic conversion rates for funds transfer. Even within countries, we find that the lowest paid workers are often charged huge fees just to be paid. So these people lack protection. So there is a limit, I would think, to the amount of education you can produce at that level. They're poor. They may lack basic education to begin with. They're doing menial work. So you can't load it all on them. But I think it's incumbent on policymakers to become more aware of what they're actually doing to the poorest in their countries, whether they're citizens or not. And I think one of the reasons why the IGF is such a good avenue for coordination is to do the capacity building and raising awareness there. If we're serious about financial inclusion, then we have to figure out ways to include people. And we've done it at the technical level. This could be rolled out tomorrow. But who's going to take on the risk of serving the poor, who admittedly are higher risk than the rich? The rich and the known. So there is a risk there, and we need to determine who's going to take that risk, and who's going to help them, and who's going to educate basically everybody else in the system. I could go on and on. There are many ways to finance looking after the poor. You can start taxing the rich, for instance. But if you don't know what's happening, if you don't know people are paying 60% interest on payday loans, if you don't know that they're being charged 20% to transfer their money home to grandparents who are looking after their children, then your conscience is clear. So let's start where we can get some international coordination and develop a conscience on this, and then work our way out. Thanks.
Very important. At this, Tiffany, I'll give you two examples that at least I know of from India. One is the Universal Service Obligation Fund. So, the telephony took up big time, in India. And given that we had at that time 1.3 billion people, what the government did is that 65% of our population lives in villages. Telephony is not going to be viable by private sectors. So they said, so when you take the urban circle license for a state, a portion of the money will go to the Universal Service Obligation Fund, what the money you pay to buy the spectrum, which will be used by the state's telecom provider to provide telephony at subsidized rate. So that was a very interesting, I would say, inclusive innovation where they said, you make money, part of the license fees go to the Universal Service Obligation Fund to provide broadband. The second was the CSR, the corporate social responsibility. So if you reach a certain threshold of a turnover as a private sector company, 2% of your profits have to be spent in CSR on a project you choose. So I think if you look at, I'm sure there are multiple examples of that, to do, but this is very good to say profit for a purpose. So make money, but make sure that people who are deprived, people who are not connected, they actually get to benefit out of that. Now, the points that you have raised logically take me to AVRI, the Schools of Internet Governance. I think I'm looking forward to AVRI's response on this as to how we are addressing the, I would say, complex challenge of capacity building. Doesn't seem to be so easy one.
Thank you for the question. I First of all, I actually really very much enjoyed all the discussions we had, because each one of them went down a separate path that, looked at the capacity building in a particular problem area, in a particular issue area, and looked at its relationship to governance. Call it internet governance, call it digital governance, again, without we call it financial digital governance, any number of names we can give to what's being talked about. But each one of them showed that, and this was just dipping a little, imagine what actually goes on in the dynamic. So when you look at, for example, when I look at it from a school perspective, how do is it a 3-day school, a 3-week school, a master's program? How do you look at how you convey this, how you dig down into these topics and build the larger picture that is governance? And that's where also, and I'm talking too fast again, Sao Paulo guidelines. How does that tie together how we do all these things? So what the DCs, the dynamic coalitions, are bringing is these individual threads, these individual issues that we need to work on. And then within the IGF or other frameworks, we start to bring that together and say, when you're talking about governance, you're talking about these many issues, and you're talking about the threads that go through them. So I very much see this sort of as an essential sort of sustainable, or needs to be sustained, part of our fulfilling the IGF's, or in the future, the GDC's commitment to capacity building, under the many names that it might come. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did, Avri. And I am going back to about very important point he has raised. And I remember I was in a multilateral bodies interministerial roundtable, I think somewhere around 2010 or 11. And there were representatives of governments, including my government. And I told that, most of the people who come from the bureaucracy would be here for 3 days, nod their head. When they go back to the country, they'll forget everything. So how do you train the bureaucracy? Should we have a crash course? And I think he pointed to a very important point about the language for policymakers, for internet governance, and for capacity building. So what do you think there is a scope for us to think about a crash course for bureaucracy or technocrats across countries on capacity building for policy and regulation? I'd want your views on that.
Yes, thank you for that question, Rajendra. And if I'd answered to this, I would probably be a rich man by now. But unfortunately, that is not totally the case. But yes, I think there is a role. And as I said, the IGF has a lot of capacity that is, to some extent, unused at this point in time. Because we do have the parliamentary track, we have a high-level track, but our outcomes are the work that's going on all through the year presented there. And I can't tell you that answer because I've never been invited to present it. So I don't know if others are, but perhaps that makes it a more positive answer. But it starts with making people in these positions understand that we're not talking about a technical topic. Yes, deploying DNS security or RPKI, you need a technician to physically do that. But it's in the mindset of decision makers around the world, whether that happens or not. Do they understand that cybersecurity may not be their own organization's responsibility? In part, it is training your people, etc., but the rest is most likely outside of your organization. Because if I look at my own small company, there is no way that I am able to put in DNS security or have routing security or transport security, except perhaps building a secure website. That is something that I may be able to do myself if I train myself hard enough, but not if I use a platform that already exists. And I think that is a far more simple question to get into the heads of people with responsibility, that this is not about technique, this is about protecting yourself, this is about protecting your customers, your environment, the people around you, so that they can connect with you in a secure way. And that is something totally different than starting to talk about technical solutions. And I think that that is the reason why the tool that we've made with people with arguments that technicians can use towards their superiors is so tremendously popular compared to the other reports that we've done. Because they are provided with arguments. And I think that that is the sort of message that we have to start constructing together. It's a different narrative, and that makes it also most likely better understandable with people with a non-technical background, but who are in deciding positions. So the answer is a bit long, but yes, I think we can organize ourselves in a way that this message is repeated again and again. And my personal experience is that after hearing a message 3 times, that is the moment that people are starting to act. The first time they think, what is the strange message and a strange guy telling this? The second time, hey, I've heard that before. And the third time, perhaps I should be doing something. So I think that that is the way the IGF can organize itself, because it's uniquely positioned to bring these people together. And then it is about organizing ourselves in a way that we get messages across that we develop together. Well, let me stop there, because I think that that is what we need to do from 2026 onwards in the IGF community. Thank you, Rajendra.
Thank you, Ward. I think very important. And I remember my experience, when I started working with the minister. It took me a long time to make my bureaucrats understand the word interoperability. They couldn't even pronounce it. But once they got a hang of it, it became a favorite topic for them. But as with time, technology is evolving so fast that by the time we learn it, something new has come. So that makes the role of IGR much more central, at the same time much more responsive rather than just being responsible, because things are moving pretty fast. On the way the internet is evolving, the technologies associated are evolving, and this brings me to Utah, who is in a very important dynamic coalition of children in the digital environment. So Utah, how do you see the experience working with policymakers and the entire ecosystem when you talk to about children and the future and the technology and the capacity building? It's a very complex topic, not so easy as a word, capacity building. We have seen today there are 8 or 9 dimensions. I'm sure if we did this whole one-day workshop, there'll be probably 20 dimensions of capacity building. So, I get very excited. The future of humanity is with the children, the dynamic coalitions like your team's dynamic coalition. What is your view on this, and how are we preparing for that?
Yes, Rajendra. When you, at the beginning of this session, you said that we should be talking about the young generation because they are the future, but referring to our debates with policymakers, we very often get the feeling that children's rights are something that is addressed when there is time for it, but not when it's necessary and urgent. So it's always put a little bit behind, and that's why we have to do really strong advocacy work in this regard, because of course it's right, children are the future, and we have to make sure that they will be able to benefit from the digital environment, and that means we need to build up their capacities as well. And going back to everyday life, we see that there are so many benefits in everyday life when people are able to make use of digital services, but many of them are just not in the position. Say, given they have access to the internet, how do they know to make use of a service that provides them, for example, with current data on air pollution, to adjust their everyday life to the needs that come out of that? If that's a bad situation of air pollution, probably they won't go out of the house. But how do they know to access this information, even though it might be provided by the administration? And there are many other situations where people would be able to benefit from these digital services, but they are just not able to know about that. They are just not able to access the information and then probably to process the information into their everyday life habits. And secondly, let me refer to what Wout has said before on the security of the digital services. We see that children especially, but also, for example, elderly people, people with disabilities, more and more rely on digital services. Even for educational matters, they are relying on digital services, for example, when they live in remote areas. But then, if these services are not provided in a secure and stable manner, if the infrastructure is not secure enough, then probably people will even be in a worse situation when they rely on having access to these services. So there is a strong connection between the security issues on the one hand and the reliance of the people on these services and their capacities to be able to deal with these services, to make the best out of it. So that is my plaidoyer. I'm pleading for more digital literacy training that is really related to people's everyday life, because that's also a lesson that we have learned. The better you can integrate what you learn into your everyday life, the easier it is to acquire these competencies.
Thank you so much. Yuta. Very well said. Mohammed Shabir, I come to you on the fact that as technologies transition from basic internet to artificial intelligence, and that too they keep scaling up in terms of evolution, how do we prepare the people with disabilities or special abilities in this age of AI and machine learning?
Thank you, Rajendra, for this question. And this is the question that we keep coming back to, that how we train people with disabilities. But my answer may not appeal to some people, but it's not, yes, we need to train people with disabilities, build their capacities. But before we do that, we need to train people who built these technologies to make and build them accessible. Because if you don't do that, you are not just making your technologies inaccessible to the people who may have benefited more from these technologies as compared to the people who would benefit, but their benefit would be lesser than the person with impairments. Let me just give you an example to elaborate this point. For instance, the facility to transfer funds or pay bills from the access of your home or comfort of your home through using online portals is a facility for everyone. But for a person with disability, be visual impairment, be a wheelchair user, or be the person with hard of hearing or hearing impaired, is it's more comfortable because then they don't have to make arrangements to go out on the bank, on the shop, and they can pay bills from the comfort of their home. And people, in case of people who are hard of hearing, in their case, they don't have to get interpreters to communicate with the banking staff or the shopkeepers to pay bills or to transfer funds. So while these facilities are important for everyone, I would say these are more important for people with disabilities. But unfortunate situation is that most of the portals and banking websites that are built, particularly in the regions which we so-called tagged as developing or global south. In these regions, these facilities are not built keeping in mind the requirements of people who face impairments, and they are made disabled because of the barriers that they face. Now, coming to the to your question that how do we do this in the age of AI, the need is even more today to train the people who are building these technologies, that there are people who are benefiting from these technologies in some instances more than the people originally intended these technologies were for. So these people need to be trained, the developers, the policymakers, the decision makers who are having the decisions in their hands of building these technologies, that there is a huge community that has specific needs, and there are standards. If they follow those techniques and standards, these technologies can be built accessible for everyone. And if they do that, they will not just be because it's a misunderstanding also that if these technologies are built accessible, they will only be used for people with disabilities. It's not like that. For instance, a requirement of transcription, human captioning, used for IGF and convinced by DICAD and some other institution now is being used for so many purposes. I can elaborate on those purposes, but I think this is not the time. So I stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Shabir. And very important points. I think when I reflect back on the discussions we have on this issue of capacity building, and there is also a very important element of demographics that we need to address. So while one side, Utah takes care of the child rights, yesterday I was with the chairman of a multilateral body. He made a very important point that Japan has millions of deserted homes because they have seniors who cannot take care of the wealth probably they have created, or the children are also equally old. Now, that brings us to a very important question that we should not miss out on the issue of capacity building for seniors. That's what our financial inclusion. Even when you look at insurance, people can only pay insurance income premiums when they have income. And we know that for sure seniors or older adults do not have that income, but they do have issues of taking care of their health, about other needs. So when it comes to financial inclusion, are there any best practices? Are there any PPPs like private public partnerships, any innovations that you're aware of that can address the issue of capacity building for this huge chunk of population that's coming towards us? Japan has already got this issue. We are seeing India has already 150 million senior citizens. I'm sure other countries, we are getting towards an aging world now. So capacity building in that context for financial inclusion.
I think seniors is a very neglected area of education. And as you point out, seniors are getting squeezed both if they're on fixed income, and we are suffering inflation, and it's going to get a whole lot worse with the trade war that's going on globally. There's very few countries that have been spared tariffs. So food prices are going up, health costs go up for seniors. They're unable to squeeze into the budget the money that they need to hire the help they need to maintain their homes, to maintain their gardens, whatever. And there's also a rental affordability crisis in many countries. So this is an issue. The problem is, in my opinion, governments have. Sorry to pick on governments. Please remember, I was a government person, so I'm criticizing our own work. I only saw one decent program for educating seniors in my travels with ICANN over the past 15 years, and that was Singapore. They had I think it was called Silver Surfers, and they really focused on getting seniors to understand what they were doing on the internet. I do a lot of volunteer work with seniors organizations in one form or another, and they're very, very vulnerable to cybercrime. They also, particularly if they have any religious affiliation, they are then known givers, and therefore subject to these grandfather scams and all the terrible things that criminals have devised to separate people from their money. So have we come up with, this is the kind of curriculum that could be shared through the IGF. If we could develop a seniors curriculum of what seniors need to know when they get onto the internet, that would cut costs for governments. Educating people is a huge cost. One of the reasons we were able to get data protection law through in my country was that the Direct Marketing Association were fighting the whole education problem, and it would be very useful to them to have the government take on the role of educating people as to what they should be doing to protect their privacy, because all of these things cost money. So the more we can coordinate through the IGF a basic curriculum, the closer we are to educating seniors. At the moment, I would not advise any seniors to jump into using new financial payment systems because they don't have the basis, the groundwork to protect themselves. And that's not a burden that you can load onto the new fintech companies. They're trying to cut costs and make things smooth and frictionless. Taking on the rather large job of educating seniors on how to surf the internet, that's a big job that has been neglected.
Very important point, Stephanie, and I would go to Wout. He made this very important point of influential stakeholders. Wout, when it comes to the important topic of capacity building, who do you think would be the influential stakeholders to talk about issues? I think this particular webinar has thrown out very important action points for us as the dynamic coalitions. The topics have been brought forth. And who are the influential stakeholders that we could start working with to create the framework that Stephanie is talking about for seniors or older adults, or even for other issues that we have spoken here?
I was about to raise my hand, as you perhaps saw just now, because I wanted to respond to what Stephanie was saying, is that yes, we cannot burden the financial system with education, but we can burden them with protecting themselves and their customers better. There is a tool called internet.nl, which I'm the coordinator international of because we're trying to build a community, which we're launching at the IGF in Lillestrøm formally. Another hat, sorry. But if you put your local bank in there, just to test it, then you can see how secure the bank is. And if it does not offer DNS security, if it does not offer a secure website, etc., it means that everything you communicate with that bank is insecure. In other words, it's quite easy for criminals to find data on you that they can use against you, and then the bank says it's your problem. But the cause is not my problem because it's them not offering a level of security or demanding from their service providers a level of security that is needed to protect me and my financial situation. To just put it on me, but of everybody, of course. So if you talk about stakeholders, how do you get that across? And in IS3C, we have been desperately trying to get regulators on the consumer side into the debate, to bring the consumer protection organizations into this debate. And it's pushing a stone uphill. Every time when you think, okay, now I've got the attention, then they just disappear again because there's nothing that can force them to work with us. And the same goes for governments. They're almost conspicuously absent in all the discussions that we have within IS3C. So it seems like they're not interested in outcomes. So we have to organize ourselves in a different way. And perhaps this is better for some other DCs. I don't know how the situation is for others, but we as IGF can organize ourselves in a way that policymakers and that ministers at least hear what outcomes are. And if we want that to happen, it does mean that high level sessions have to allow for messages that come out of the IGF process. And that will demand from us as DC certain levels of quality that we may not be used to at this moment because we're bottom up and free going. But it does mean that we may have to be vetted in a way to be allowed to give this sort of messages. And I know this is dangerous territory because we are bottom up and etc. But if we want to get messages to the right people, that messages have to be of a quality level that they're immediately usable by these organizations. Once they get the message, then they will want to act upon it. But then the message will have to be 100% right. So my answer goes two ways. One is, I think we already have the people present at the IGF that we want to share the messages with. But the other side is that we will have to do something about managing our quality paths. And for some, it may be okay. For others, maybe not yet. But it's something we can do together to make sure it happens. And if that is our goal and our wish, and we need to discuss that over the coming years so that we're prepared for 2026. Now, I see Roman smiling a little bit, so perhaps you would like to respond later, Roman. But I think two answers to your question, Rajendra. Thank you.
Thanks, Wout. I have Yuta and then Mohammed Shabir.
Yes, thank you for giving me the floor again. I just wanted to pick up on the elderly people and the basic curriculum that Stephanie Perrine has mentioned. And in Germany, we have, as in many European countries, an aging population. We have more elderly people than we have young people in our countries. And therefore, we also have a lot of programs, training programs for elderly people. We have these basic curricula. We have train the trainer guidance for elderly people, training other elderly people, for younger people, working with elderly people. So it's not that there is nothing there, but still I have to refer to what I said before. We have such a fast development in this area that once we have set up the curriculum, there is a new mobile payment service, for example. There is the next step of the app that I have been using for my banking account. And there we need to have the banking industry also on our side. They all have pushed, at least in Germany, for elderly people to set up their online banking account, to do all these things. So they have invested somehow, but that was also because it was in their own interest, because to close the local banking point for people, so that they should only do online banking. So and we need to take them into account for this, that they could not just offer the online service without training the people, and that is definitely an obligation that goes to the financial service, but to all the other areas as well. It's the administrative services from the community, from the government, that people need to be trained on to benefit on that. And in the moment, as was already written in the chat, it's mostly social service, civil society organizations, volunteers that are doing this job. And we don't have kind of a framework where these issues are addressed. Thank you.
Mohammed Shabir.
Thank you, Rajendra. Just quick intervention on the topics of seniors, as I more often than not say that disability is transgender, geography, and age. While we all know that as we age, our bodies they will be decaying, and we will be losing functioning performance of some of our faculties that functions today. Uh, the problem of aging and seniors is more complex and enhanced in global south, I would say. As everyone was saying, the developed world, they have their own established systems to educate seniors. But in the global south, countries and even people themselves do not consider the aging factor and getting education of how to use devices in an accessible way. The technology enables. There are certain facilities which people, due to the lack of the information, they are unable to use that. For instance, a very senior person retired from a very senior level position, very educated one. When he was, we tell him that he can use the mobile and technology built in to read newspapers. It was a small thing, just using the magnifying screen reading facilities on his mobile device. He was so happy that he started crying just because he did not knew earlier that the technology existed, the facility existed. He did not had the awareness and information how to use that technology for his benefit, because he had contracted an impairment at a later stage of his age, whereas in while he was using his facilities, he was not even considerate of whether he should be prepared for his next stage of the life or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Shabir. And I think I always keep saying that in today's age, if you don't have the digital capability, it is a digital disability. That itself is a disability, not being digitally capable. And I think we have a lot of action items coming from this discussion. I see a very important point from Ramune, if I get the name pronounced right, that public libraries have an important role to play. And I've seen that in Colombia and Medellin, how it has changed the way that city, that country has changed. And this is a complex topic, and we have looked at so many ideas and frameworks as our action points going forward. I really thank you for a very engaging discussion. This is the first time we moved from webinar to a meeting, and a great support from the Secretariat and from you all to join us. I pass it over to my colleague Roman, who is doing the closing remarks, and thanks.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, dear audience, participants, speakers, moderator, our team who is behind it, our colleagues in the secretariats. We believe it is an important step, and we continue this discussion in Norway. So we hope that all of you would be interested to be present there, either on site or online, and wish you good luck in all your endeavors, and see you next time on the next webinar.
Thanks.